Australia's econocrats, particularly the Reserve Bank, I think are an honourable exception to the criticisms that I've been making. They've been much less naive about the operation of unregulated markets. Ian Macfarlane, the former governor of the Reserve Bank, was terribly concerned about the boom in the housing market, much more concerned much earlier than most other people, and worked very hard to try and talk down the boom, with some success, surprisingly, and also had the research people in the Reserve Bank doing a lot of work on the nature of the boom and the things that were driving it. So in Australia, we avoided making the same errors with our banking system for that reason, but also because of two accidents. First, the Four Pillars policy banned mergers between the big four banks and so kept them out of trouble because of the politicians' fear of the displeasure of the electorate if those banks were allowed to merge, more than the politicians' fear of the displeasure of the banks. And they were terribly displeased, and they were running an argument throughout that period saying it's this very bad thing that we're not allowed to merge, that we're not allowed to become national champions, that we can't get stronger in Australia and use it as a base to trade overseas and so on. All the things which, had they happened, would have got them into as much trouble, or about as much trouble, as the British and the American and European banks had got themselves into. So that was the first fortunate thing. It was never really intended. Its motivation was primarily political, and that is the electorate would be very upset. The politicians knew the electorate would be very upset if our big four banks were allowed to merge, because if they merged, they would go from 4 to 2. And the second kind of happy accident was that our Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, we have one regulatory authority responsible for regulating the financial system, APRA, and it was riding herd on the banks because it was still smarting from the caning it got over its inadequate supervision of the HIH insurance company. So there was a case where the failure of HIH, which we were all terribly concerned about at the time, in retrospect was a kind of happy accident. It certainly happened at the right time to keep APRA on its guard. But now let's get back to the general, more US-oriented story. In their drive for profits, people in the financial markets invented ever more sophisticated and artificial, if you like, weird and wonderful, financial contracts known as derivatives. In theory, these synthetic contracts are about risk management, spreading and shifting risk to those most able to bear it. In practice, as David said, the risk was spread to those least able to understand it, because they were the people who took the risk, not understanding what they were doing to themselves. Even the inventors of those derivatives didn't fully understand how they worked and the circumstances under which they could come unstuck. Individual financial institutions didn't understand the size of the risks they were taking on, and no one, neither other institutions nor the regulators, knew where the risk was accumulating. That was one of the reasons for all the panic in the financial markets, particularly after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, because nobody knew where the risk was being borne. And so when I don't know whether you're a safe bank or a risky bank, I, as another bank, become reluctant to deal with you, because I don't know how risky you are. I don't know how heavily you're into these toxic assets. And so the banks become reluctant to deal with each other, which means, of course, they end up being reluctant to deal with ordinary customers. So my third point is that derivatives were a case of the market being too smart by half and not nearly as smart as it imagined itself to be. I don't know whether you noticed, but at many points in David's exposition of what went wrong, he alluded to the consequences of excessive gearing, or leverage as the Americans call it, or plain old excessive borrowing, which is what those two fancy words really mean. His story was littered with references to debt. The reason booms go on for so long and get so big is that they're fed by excessive borrowing. While everything's on the up and up, borrowing is a very easy way to magnify your gains from investment. As you know from negatively geared property investment, if you put up only a bit of the money and borrow a lot more of the money, in David's example, if you put up $1 and borrow $10 and buy an asset that's worth $11, you have to pay interest on the money you've borrowed, and eventually you have to pay that money back, but you keep all the capital gains, even though you've only put up 1/11 of the capital. You keep all the capital gains, you get a tax deduction for the interest payments, and the capital gains are taxed concessionally at half rates in Australia. So that's a very attractive form of investment. It's a way to get rich quick, as long as property prices keep rising. And you know that capital gains will be there when eventually you decide to sell the asset. The trouble is that once prices start falling, being highly geared is a way to magnify your losses and risk your survival. The thing about debt, or credit as economists prefer to call it, sounds much nicer, credit, than debt. The thing about debt is that it's like fire, a wonderfully useful and beneficial thing, but also something that, if not understood and carefully controlled, can do immense harm. Yet economic theory focuses almost solely on the benefits of credit, hardly acknowledging how dangerous it can be if allowed to get out of control, out of hand. Why such a cavalier attitude towards debt? Because of the assumption that we're all rational. Because of the economic model's unrealistic assumptions about human nature. Because since we're all rational, we would never misuse debt. We'd never borrow more than we should and never get into trouble. So my fourth point is that a primary cause of the crisis was the failure of regulators to understand the need to impose constraints on excessive gearing. The sudden discovery of all the trouble derivatives have got us into wouldn't have caused nearly so much devastation had not the institutions that found themselves holding the parcel when the music stopped been so precariously geared. So when you have these strange things that we didn't understand called derivatives, but you put them on top of a situation where the people holding those derivatives were very highly geared, then it's like kind of smoking in a petrol dump. You're really asking for trouble. That's what we were doing. And indeed, some of the derivatives were themselves aimed at helping people gear up.